Modernism is not an ideology, but an idea. Modernization is the special name for the change of societies within the framework of that idea. But the problem is that psychologically people have to believe in something. In fact, studies in recent years have shown that people are fleeing from institutional religions and turning towards spiritualism. So with the exception of Western Europe, there is still a secularization there. In the rest of the world, we see a movement back to religion. In fact, it is no longer possible to talk about a crisis of religion, but a crisis of secularism. I'm saying two exceptions.
Hello everyone from the Istanbul School. Dear audience, today we will talk about the processes of modernization and secularization. Our guest is Prof. Dr. Vejdi Bilgin. Welcome, teacher.
Welcome.
How are you?
Thank you. He should ask about you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Professor, we say modernization, secularization. We use these concepts frequently and we want to talk about these processes. First of all, let's start with a definition if you want. What do we mean by modernization? What does modernization mean?
Yes, these two concepts are used very often in daily life, but the definition of modernization is a bit behind. In other words, when we say modern today, we understand something different from what was called modern a century ago. Gradually, secularization is also a bit behind. That is why it has become much more important to understand and grasp these definitions today, because it is misunderstood. Let's start in a classical way. When we say modernization, we understand a series of changes that have developed especially in Western Europe and North America since the 18th century. In essence, modernism is a democratic way of thinking and lifestyle that centers on the individual, rejects the traditional authority of the church, is anthropocentric, and respects human rights. We call the evolution of societies in accordance with this modern philosophy modernization. In other words, let's not say modernism is an ideology, but it is a thought. Modernization is the specific name of the change in societies within the framework of that thought. But the problem is, do all societies modernize or not? That's why Western sociologists, for example Anthony Giddens, say yes to the question of whether modernity is a project specific to the West. Modernization is a project specific to the West. It is the specific name of a series of changes in Western Europe and North America. Now, if you ask what this change is, what happened? The most important change is, of course, industrialization. Along with industrialization, urbanization occurred in the West. Because while there was no central city in agricultural societies, in industrial societies, industrial cities where raw materials flow and factories are located need to be in the center. Accordingly, some cities grew very large. When cities grew, the nuclear family emerged. Previously, there was a large family in the countryside. The extended family broke down. With the emergence of nation-states, education and training opportunities increased. Education started to be provided in every village and every town. As educational opportunities increased, social mobility also emerged. In other words, the son of a shepherd in a village, like in the Republic of Turkey, Süleyman Demirel is the best example of this. He became prime minister president. First he became an engineer, then he entered politics, etc. Of course, the kingdom regimes collapsed. With nation-states, democratic regimes emerged. When I say kingdoms, it may be misunderstood. Let's call them totalitarian regimes. Because as in the case of England, there are societies where kingdoms and democracy go hand in hand. We are talking about a series of changes. And at the same time, and this is a theory, of course it's an assertion, modern societies have gradually started to move away from religion. We call this secularization. So modernization is a special name for a series of changes in the West, in Europe and North America, which includes secularization.
So how did this modernization process develop and change outside the West?
Now, from the 19th century onwards and in the first half of the 20th century for various reasons. What are these reasons? One, there are direct relations between societies, there are political relations, students assent, there are commercial relations. With these relations, or as you know, if we take the Islamic world as an example, the Westerners colonized almost the rest of the Islamic world and the rest of the world, except for a few land masses. They have also transferred their ideologies, lifestyles, and education there. Therefore, a modernization started outside the West, and by West I mean outside Western Europe and North America. But this modernization was never exactly like the modernization that took place in the West. We are still in the last stages of this modernization process. But today we are also facing a situation called late modernity or post-modernity. But all societies have modernized to a greater or lesser extent. This is called non-Western modernization, non-Western modernization. Non-Western modernization is usually done by political elites. That is, it is a modernization that comes from a top-down imposition, and it is also a traumatic modernization. If you ask what is traumatic about it, the West has modernized its own family structure, manners, towns and neighborhoods, and even clothing within its own natural process. But everywhere else in the world, societies have modernized by completely abandoning their traditional structures. In other words, modernization did not naturally take the form of a traditional German house, traditional German music, German dress evolving towards modernity. We modernized by abandoning our music, by abandoning our clothes, by abandoning our philosophical system of thought, by abandoning our roles in the family, for example, by abandoning the plan of the house. Let's think in terms of the house. You know, the house we call courtyard, the house we call life does not have compartments, right? We have an entrance, a hall, a living room, a balcony. We are talking about a completely Western-style house. Therefore, non-Western modernization is a somewhat traumatic modernization. In fact, no non-Western society has ever been a fully Western society, because it would be like some kind of extraordinary miracle in which one society is completely unlike the other. So the whole world has experienced a troubled process in this respect.
So are modernization and secularization concepts that necessitate each other? Can we see it that way?
Now, according to classical sociological theory, this is the case. Just as modernization without industrialization is unthinkable, a modern society without a nuclear family is unthinkable, therefore a society without secularization is unthinkable. Indeed, in the West especially, the dominance of the Church gradually lost its influence first on politics and then on society, and its influence on institutions, and people started believing without belonging, meaning they were members of the Church but did not feel like they belonged or were not members of the Church at all. Church attendance decreased and worship decreased. Therefore, secularization was seen as the most natural result of modernization. Here we immediately defined what secularization is and modernization. In essence, the event we call secularism is the individual's perception of himself and the world he lives in. It is to understand, comprehend, and live independently of religion, without religious restrictions or concerns, whether it is the physical world or the natural social world. Secularism is both a worldview and an ideology that has been put forward especially since the Enlightenment. In other words, there is a thought that societies need to be freed from religious concerns and anxieties in order to be more advanced, more prosperous, and more peaceful. Secularization means, first of all, the individual's consciousness being freed from religious concerns and anxieties, naturally reflecting this in his daily life, and then the separation of social institutions from religion, one by one or in their entirety. In other words, an individual can be secular, for example, a legal institution, a family institution, a political institution. An educational institution can also be secular. When the entire society is completely freed from religious concerns and anxieties, we call that society a secular society. This process is called secularization. Classical sociologists were of the opinion that there was such a tendency in the world. Now, the concept is like this. In fact, the concept of secular is a religious concept. Let's explain that too. In the Christian understanding, people are divided into two. There is a class of clergymen who have undergone priestly ordination called the clergy. There is also a class of laity who are not clergymen. However, this class we call laity is not secular in the sense we understand today. These are people who have not received religious education, who have not undergone priestly ordination, who are religious, who attend church services, but cannot, for example, conduct mass or perform confessions. In other words, they are not clergymen. Priests were also divided into two. The first type of priests were those who lived in monasteries or in theological schools, and the other type were priests who were among the people. The priests who were among the people and served were called secular clergy. But this did not mean that they were not religious, but that they were among the people. But later on, secularization with its French pronunciation, was used to mean that something that was religious ceased to be religious and became worldly. This was also used for the first time in 1648. In 1648, the great religious wars called the 30 Years' War ended. European societies made peace. The basic motto of peace is that every citizen is free to worship and believe in whatever religion they want. Previously, this meant that the citizen had to follow the religion of the prince. This is being eliminated. So my prince can be Catholic, but I can be Lutheran. A religious peace. In this religious peace, the Treaty of Westphalia of 1648 is the basis of the European Union. This treaty is still in force. Some of the church's property was taken away and given to kings and princes. In other words, those properties were religious properties, and they ceased to be religious and became secular. The concept is used here for the first time. Later, without a name, Max Weber expresses this concept as the cleansing of the world from magic. So, he says, in traditional societies, individuals thought of everything religiously. This year, the weather is going to be dry. Why? Because you are a sinner. God punished us. So we had an accident. Why? Because it's the month of mobilization. The month of expedition brings bad luck. While all kinds of events were interpreted in a religious way, especially with the development of modern science, our consciousness now sees that traffic accidents are caused by bad traffic in Turkey. So we have evolved to an understanding that we think that drought is due to natural causes, such as our pollution of nature, depletion of the ozone layer. This, he says, is the cleansing of the world from magic. In other words, when we look at it with today's logic, one now has a secular point of view, a point of view independent of religion. The great 19th century sociological fathers had secular utopias when they envisioned future societies, even if they did not call them secular. For example, Auguste Comte said that we will come to a positivist society. In this positivist society, he said, an understanding of science based on experiment and observation, that is positivism, would prevail. In Karl Marx's completely free communist society, there would be no religion, because religion is a tool of exploitation. When we abolish private property, he said, religion will disappear anyway. And they believed in this so much that, according to Auguste Comte, we have left the metaphysical period, we have entered the positive period, we are entering it. According to Karl Marx, through revolutions we can abolish private property and move to a free communist society. Moreover, he is an activist. He is working for this. In other words, they were of the opinion that Europe in the 19th century was evolving towards an unspecified secular utopian society. They were of the opinion that Europe was evolving towards a society. But the theory entered sociology in the 1960s. I mean, in today's sense. The most important founder and representative of this is Peter Berger. In his work, translated into Turkish as The Sacred Umbrella, he argued that due to a number of reasons, namely industrialization, especially communist states and modern science, both Eastern Europe and Western Europe were becoming increasingly secularized. What are the concrete things? For example, as people become more educated, for example, they move away from religion. As they become urbanized, they move away from religion. There was an idea that middle-aged people, men, children, or young people are more secular than women, that they are moving away from religion. Therefore, secularization itself was a natural process and result of modernization. That was the theory.
In fact, this is something that is still being debated today. Are we becoming secular? Since we are not becoming religious with the increase in science, there is something else here. Is secularization a correct definition? Or is something else happening and we are defining it this way? Because there are some damages in the concepts. You say worldliness, you say secularization. Can we give the right meanings to these concepts? Or do we define it this way because we see it differently?
Several important developments have now occurred in the world. In other words, developments that attract the attention of sociologists. The first one is the United States of America, the most developed, the most industrialized country in the world. In 1976 or 77, probably 76, an evangelical fundamentalist was elected president, Jimmy Carter. Now, there are evangelical fundamentalists in America, but sociologists did not pay attention to them. They were thought of as marginal people, people who were happy and living in their own way. They started to act like a third party in America and started to determine the power. Of course, a lot of research has been done. At one point, the percentage of Americans who identified themselves as fundamentalists was as high as 48%. Some studies put it as low as 20%. So 1 out of every 5 Americans or 1 out of every 2 Americans is a fundamentalist. In Turkish, they translate this as fundamentalist. It is more correct to say fundamentalist or fundamentalist. Apart from that, for a very long time, the Soviet Union and the countries around it propagated atheism in official education. They called it scientific atheism. But in 1989 to 90, the Eastern Bloc collapsed. The Berlin Wall came down. The communist states declared their independence and religion resurfaced. However, there should have been no religion at all. Even today, the most religious country in Europe is Poland. Poland is a former Eastern Bloc country. Although religiousness should be very weak there, it is one of the most religious countries in Europe. Why is that? Of course, it is also mentioned that Pope John Paul II was very Polish. When you look at the Muslim world, you know that the Muslim world was mostly liberated from colonies between 1945, 1950, 1960. This is the struggle for independence from colonialism. When we look at it from today's point of view, those who were in leadership were people who were not very religious, who had been educated in Europe, who had grasped the Western mindset, who had adopted it to some extent, but who had organized their countries for the independence of their nations. Therefore, it was envisaged that all Islamic countries would gradually become secularized in the same way as in the West. But from the 1970s onwards and until today, that is, until the 2010s in Turkey, Iran, which are the countries closest to the West, and also relatively developed countries. In Egypt and in Algeria, a former French colony, very strong religious movements emerged. They came to power. Religious movements emerged in the Far East. Then Peter Berger said in the late 1980s that I was wrong. I mean, with the exception of Western Europe, there is still a secularization there. In the rest of the world, we see a movement back to religion. In fact, it is no longer possible to talk about the crisis of religion, but the crisis of secularism. Peter Berger says there are two exceptions. One is that Western Europe is still progressing in the secularization phase, and there is still a secular intellectual mass in the rest of the world. But he says, interestingly, in the Islamic world, religious intellectuals have started to rise from this secular intellectual mass. In other words, his parents and grandparents had a modern worldview, but the child is an intellectual university professor, writer, poet, etc. Therefore, the moment he says that we have returned from secularization, that is when the real red apocalypse of sociology breaks out. Many studies come up with counter-arguments. Now, it is not possible to count them all, but one of them, Steve Bruce, says that there has been an unnecessary change of heart. I mean, there was a religiousization in America, but he says America urbanized late. Now there is a resecularization in America, so the children of fundamentalists are not as religious as their fathers. So in the Islamic world, there was a religiousization in the former communist bloc countries, but it was because of political issues. Political ethnic issues have come together with religion, and religion seems to be on the rise again. In fact, according to what Steve Bruce has said, by 2030, there will be no one left in England who is affiliated with the Methodist Church. He says this: there is a big break from mainstream religions. Mainstream religions. So Catholicism, Lutheranism, Methodism, Orthodoxy, Islam, he says there is this rupture all over the world, but we see it at different times because the evolution of each country is different. In fact, Berger and Christian theologians like Rodley Stark say that there is a move away from institutional religion and the emergence of a subjective religiosity. My personal opinion is that these discussions need to be summarized in one place. That's it. It is not easy to claim that Islam is still on the rise today, for example, in Turkey, that more people are more religious than they were 10 years ago, but we can easily claim this. Turkey was more religious in the 1990s than in the 1960s. We have data, more or less, such as praying, fasting, going on pilgrimage, wearing a headscarf, knowing how to read the Qur'an for women, and so on. But we cannot talk about such a situation now. Let's advertise in the West, if you don't mind. In Hoja Ali Kozi's book, The Future of Religion, he gave the latest data. There is also a move away from institutional religion, but this does not mean that people are moving away from ideas, beliefs, and practices that can be seen as religious. In other words, a truly secular society that organizes its life completely according to the laws of physics and biology, that does not have beliefs such as good luck, good fortune, bad luck, sending energy to the universe, and so on. In other words, are we heading towards a phase that is completely free of religious concerns and registries?
In fact, you really have to have no beliefs at all in order to be called secular.
Secularization is essentially exactly what Marxists call scientific atheism, or what is called positivist understanding with a neighboring approach. It is not possible to have such a society. Let me express it because you said it very interesting. In fact, even Auguste Comte, at the end of his life, came up with a religion of humanity. There are those who say that this is a biographical accident that emerged because of his platonic love for Madame Clotilde Roy. He lived such a platonic love. Later, that poor woman dies of a subtle disease, namely tuberculosis, and he reveals that language of humanity, Women live in that religion, let's say that, by the way, with a central role, but it is not like that. In other words, we cannot say that this great philosopher only revealed such a thing because of a special situation in his own life. In fact, in a society where there is no religion, how will the cement hold the society together? How will the society come together? He was trying to find the answer to this. There must be some ideals, some beliefs in society, even if they don't come from institutionalized religions. Individuals cannot free themselves from these beliefs. For example, in this modern period, look, a research has also emerged in Turkey. For example, it is a study dated 2013. In Turkey, the rate of people who still believe that casting lead will cast the evil eye, that it will be beneficial, is around 11 to 12%.
That's a pretty high rate.
Quite high. In other words, while modern science is so advanced, medicine is so advanced, they believe in the benefits of casting lead. Now, those who say that going to shrines and visiting them is beneficial were around 8% in the 2013 study. 3% of these are university students. So it can be thought like this: he is a religious person. This is a controversial issue, of course, in theology. Does the soul of the dead save or not? It is the soul of the awliya, but he believes that it saves. So the awliya there will be of some benefit. It may be possible. It is compatible with the traditional structure of Turkey. But lead pouring is not in our religion either. I mean, it is in our tradition, but not in our religion. And interestingly, the people who believe in lead pouring the most are in the Western Marmara region. The Western Marmara region is Kanakkale, Tekirdağ, Kırklareli, Edirne. According to research, this region has the lowest rate of prayer. What happened? In other words, the fact that a person prays less does not mean that they do not have any belief. There is a shift in belief. For example, there is a belief in lead pouring. I am an immigrant from Bulgaria, and we may have lower rates of prayer than some segments in Turkey, for example, but we have a very strong tradition of reading Mevlit. So praying less does not mean reading less Mawlid. Apart from that, let's think about astrology, which has emerged today, right? How widespread it has become and is increasing. Yes, while these existed, now such healing integrated understandings originating from the Far East have emerged. In other words, modern medicine used to have acupuncture, hypnosis. It was trying to explain them. Now there are chakras and energy points in the body. All of these are beliefs, and people are starting to believe in them more and more. They are even combining them in religion. Therefore, what is happening in Turkey is not people completely abandoning their religious beliefs, but a process of people building their own religions that are in line with their own understanding and structure with a somewhat postmodern logic. People are literally reestablishing their own religions.
They continue to believe anyway, filling the gaps in their beliefs in other ways. This does not mean that they are actually secularized.
Yes, now this belief gap is an important word. 102 biologists, it's considered a bit popular, but they claim that there is a gene for belief in human beings. I mean, the dominant biology doesn't accept this, but in fact there is an approach in popular biology that belief is caused by a gene. At least we see it. Everyone believes in one way or another.
I mentioned a psychological void, but it could also be claimed that there is a physical void.
So there is such an understanding, but psychologically people have to believe in something. In fact, studies conducted in recent years have shown that people are running away from institutional religions and turning to spirituality and spiritualism. So these are called New Age movements. They mostly originate from the Far East, so we know it in our daily lives. In fact, it has even entered our language. Now they say karma is like this. So karma is essentially a Hindu law. In other words, it is a religious belief. We need to send positive energy to the universe. Or there are practices, for example, there are yogas and meditations. There are even approaches that this will bring success in business life. People don't pray, they don't do itikaf. You know about itikaf, right? You shut yourself in a mosque for the last 10 days of Ramadan. You don't go out, but recently it has been reflected in the press. You go into a closed wooden place and you don't come out for 24 hours, 36 hours. This is another kind of itikaf. But this is a different understanding of itikaf from the real itikaf that exists in Sufism and is actually a different spiritual experience. People are in such an approach, that is, there is a very strong literature that spiritualism emerged in the second half of the 20th century. Of course, after the 2000s and 2010s, spiritualism has disappeared, and so on. But this time, yes, for one thing, atheism is at a higher level than it has ever been in history. But people are not becoming atheists in waves as predicted. What we now call apotheism, that is apathy towards religion, is not a rejection of religion. When you look at it visually, for example, there is the baptism of his aunt's grandson. Let's talk about Catholics he attends. In our country, for example, a Mevlid will be read for his 40th birthday he attends. He is a Catholic in a cultural sense. He is a Muslim in a cultural sense. But studies talk about a period when apatheism is normally a period of increasing indifference towards religious issues. So still, atheism, what we call the secular understanding, is not on the rise as predicted. People want to believe in one thing or another. We call this subjective religiosity.
Yes, sir, we have talked extensively about modernization, secularization, and the changing understanding of religiosity today. Thank you very much for your valuable comments.
You're welcome for your efforts. I thank you.
Dear viewers, we talked about the processes of modernization and secularization. See you in the next episode. Goodbye.